Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. If I could ask everyone, please, to turn your cell phones, your BlackBerries, and please refrain from text messaging during the program. Get all those off, I would appreciate it. In Sunday's Arkansas Democrat-Gazette, I was reading the paper, this ad appeared. And it says, Lyon College, great school, great price, U.S. News and World Report, 2008. Shows the picture of the president with 3 students. And it says, the Board of Trustees of Lyon College celebrates the college's recent honors in U.S. News and World Report 2008 edition of America's Best Colleges, and it goes on. The interesting aspect is since I'm a member of the Lyon College Board, I signed this ad. Not knowing it was in there, but lending an endorsement of the U.S. News ranking system, which I do favor, by the way. Then I noticed in the Arkansas Democrat-Gazette today it came out, UA back in top rankings. U.S. News and World Report also lists Hendrix Lyon. So the rankings of these colleges and universities by U.S. News and World Report certainly commands attention, both free and paid. Russ Swearingen is a student at the Clinton School. He is a native of Rogers, Arkansas, and a graduate of Lyon College, where he compiled an outstanding academic and extracurricular record. He studied in England and at the University of South Carolina. He's also directed a youth ministries program in Birmingham and has worked in nearly all aspects of Hurricane Katrina reconstruction efforts. For his group public service project at the Clinton School, Russ is working in Northwest Arkansas with the Arkansas Department of Human Services on children's mental health issues. Russ.
Good afternoon, and again, welcome to the Clinton School of Public Service in the Fall 2007 series of public programs. I am pleased to announce that today's program is a 2-for-1 special. First off, we have Brian Kelly, who is the executive editor of the U.S. News and World Report, and he will be followed by our own Dr. Keith Nita, who is our professor of educational policy. After both speakers have finished, we will open the floor for questions. Since 1998, Brian Kelly has supervised and edited the U.S. News section of the report, one of the leading American weekly news magazines with an online and paper circulation of over 2 million. As executive editor, he is now responsible for all content on paper and online. The U.S. News and World Report is known for its extensive coverage of top national and world stories, and also the extensive ranking systems of hospitals, and at this time of year, for college students and administrators, its collegiate ranking system, and its annual list of top schools in the country. In the most recent issue, which I think some of you will find around your tables, one will find the college and university rankings for 2008, school profiles, application tips, and even financial aid assistance. With early admissions deadlines, ACT and SAT dates, and multiple college visits looming in the coming fall months, hundreds of thousands of prospective students are keeping a watchful eye on these rankings as the first part in making the all-important decision of where they will apply. The magazine also draws the attention of college administrators who know that more is attached to their ranking than simply the number of applicants to their schools. Moving up and moving down in the rankings can significantly impact a small school or even a large school. Therefore, it is all the more impressive when one imagines the extensive efforts and equations that the staff and Mr. Kelly used to determine the highly profiled and influential independent ranking. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome our distinguished guest, Mr. Brian Kelly.
Thank you, Russ. I appreciate that, and thank you for having me here, Skip, and the folks from the Clinton School. It is always a great thing to get out of Washington, D.C., and talk to some folks in the rest of the country. We are a magazine that publishes in all 50 states. Unfortunately, I do spend a little too much of my time in Washington, which is the center of the universe, as you all know, but there are things that can be learned elsewhere. Actually, I had a great lunch with Skip and realized that the Clinton School is almost like a southern extension of Georgetown, where our offices are. There's a lot of folks here who are well tuned in with what's going on in Washington as well. And what I really want to talk about is Mike Huckabee versus Hillary Clinton, which has got me really excited. If it was my choice, I would sure rather see Mike Huckabee versus Hillary Clinton with the Arkansas roots than the senator from New York running against the mayor from New York, which is also a possibility, but we'll put that aside. I joke a little bit about politics because I always try to remind folks that we do get a lot of press and a lot of attention for the U.S. News College rankings, but we do other things. We actually publish a magazine every week of the year. We have a very large website which has millions of people coming for things other than college, including college. And I probably spend about 10% of my job and my life focusing on this issue. So it isn't the only thing we're about. But I realize it's a very important thing, and it's very important to particular audiences, students, parents, and college presidents for some strange reason. We've been doing this for more than 20 years. And we have, in some years, we get more attention, and in some years less, for a variety of reasons out there. This is one of those years when the stars seem to have been aligned, and we are getting an extraordinary amount of attention for the rankings. Some of it somewhat critical. I was fortunate. It's so much attention, I suppose, that last Friday I was on the Today Show, which is not the sort of place you expect to see somebody like me sitting there with Meredith Vieira on the couch talking about our college methodology. But it was a pretty hot topic, and they ran an actually very complimentary setup piece, and they said, you know, there's all sorts of lists in America. There's the best wines, and there's the Sports Illustrated swimsuits and one thing, but this is the list. U.S. News and World Report is the list. Personally, I think the Sports Illustrated swimsuit issue is a little more interesting than what we do, but there is value to this. But the other thing that has cropped up this year is, starting in the spring, a group of presidents from some smaller liberal arts colleges got together and decided, somewhat informally, I guess, that they were opposed to the U.S. News rankings, and we're going to try to get their institutions to not participate in them. You may have seen some of the publicity that generated. There was quite a few stories as this so-called boycott has evolved, and there was a number of arguments made against the rankings, and it's generated a lot of media attention. So I think that's probably one of the reasons we're sort of right in the center of everybody's radar, or bullseye, this year. And I'll talk a little bit about that. Fundamentally, you know, our feeling is that we just disagree with them philosophically. We think that, you know, the argument of these liberal arts presidents is that universities and colleges are very specific, nuanced institutions that really can't be quantified. Each college has its own personality, its own particular characteristics, and that you really can't reduce it to numbers on a page. And I take their point to an extent. These are individual, intricate institutions, but I also think that you know, we could say we fundamentally disagree. They can be reduced on some levels to numbers and metrics, and there are ways to measure things, and that's what we're about. So what I'd like to do, I sometimes when I get in these conversations, I sort of get in filibuster mode and sort of walk people through the whole history of the rankings and just make their eyes glaze over so they won't ask any questions, but I'm not going to do that today. Skip assures me that this is a very feisty bunch and people are going to have good questions, and I want to leave time for that. I know there's even an in-house critic here, so I'm certainly open to talking about this. So what I'd like to do is just sort of run through quickly an overview of how I see this, and then leave time for your criticisms. I'm going to talk about why we do the rankings, how we do them, how we think people should use the rankings, And I realize everybody here is not trying to get into college, so it may not be directly relevant, because that is the prime audience here. And then how we respond to our critics. And then you can become your own critics, and I will be happy to talk about that. We started the rankings in 1983 on the premise that universities and colleges are some of the most powerful, important institutions in America, and they are relatively unscrutinized. We came at this then, as we do today, not as educators, as social scientists, as researchers, but as journalists. U.S. News, which has been around for 75 years, has always had a strong part of its mission in the world of consumer journalism. We're different than Time and Newsweek in some ways, in that we have always really looked for some part of what we do to be news that's more directly helpful to people, whether it's investment advice, whether it's healthcare information, or in this case, colleges. So we see our mission as a little bit different than some of the other folks. And the idea of looking at colleges was, how can you find a way on an apples-to-apples basis to compare these schools, to look at these institutions through a lens of hard numbers and some surveys, and come up with some sort of criterion that lets you weigh one against the other. Is there a way that one is perhaps better or different? So that really was the intention. And one of the things that I think motivated us then, as it does today, is that there was so little good data available about colleges. Colleges, for whatever reason, in many instances, don't really want to share this information. There was no standardized information about SAT scores and admission rates and alumni giving and the sort of things that we really have, in some ways, U.S. News has sort of forced the industry to standardize. Now, when you look at, again, we're not ranking just the top 10 schools in the country, as some people tend to focus on. We're looking at 1,400 colleges and universities across the country. Part of our intention is to level the playing field. We want to, allow Harvard to exist in the same sphere as the University of Nebraska. They're both national universities with similar characteristics and ought to be able to be compared apples to apples, just as the University of Nebraska should be compared to the University of Arkansas, to the University of California, et cetera. We have separate categories because not all schools are created equal. Liberal arts schools do exist in a different space. So you can't compare an Amherst College in Massachusetts to a Harvard College at the other end of Massachusetts. They're very different institutions, each equally prominent and very successful in their own rights, but different institutions. So we compare Amherst to the other small liberal arts schools. What our rankings are based on is a combination of hard data that we have evolved over the years, a methodology, and I won't bore you with the minutia of it, but we're very transparent about how we rank. The numbers are available in the magazine that we publish. They're available on our website. There are no secrets about how we do this. But we look at things like the SAT scores of the incoming class. We look at things like the class rank of the students coming in, the graduation rate. We've got a number of calculations involving graduation, really crucial, which is not just how many kids did you graduate, but if you're a school with a certain quality of students coming in, let's just, again, to take the example of Harvard, you would expect that Harvard would graduate, 98% of its students. But if Harvard, and this is hypothetical, if Harvard graduates only 95% of their students, that's indicative that something maybe is amiss there. And you'll see this in a variety of schools where there's a big disparity between what you would expect the school would graduate in some cases and the number of students that actually graduate. It's a complicated metric that has a lot of numbers in it, but it speaks to a bigger point, which is if a school is not graduating if it's bringing in student body at a certain quality and it's not graduating them, something's probably amiss there. We look at things like alumni giving, which is a very good indicator of the satisfaction that students had with a given school. Happy alumni tend to give more money than alumni that did not have such a good experience. These are broad measures. A lot of people will say, well, how can you possibly calculate, well, you can't. You can't calculate to an intense degree what it is that the experience somebody had on a college campus was. But you can use broad measures. And you can look at, for instance, Princeton, which is the #1 school in our ranking this year. They've been fairly dominant for the past number of years. And you can look at Harvard, which has many, many similar characteristics. But if you look at, as I mentioned, the alumni giving rate, Princeton graduates tend to give at a significantly higher rate than Harvard graduates. That's one of the differentiating factors that puts Princeton ahead of Harvard. Now, is this true? Does this tell you something? I don't honestly know I have not interviewed every single Princeton graduate and every single Harvard graduate, but I will say I know a fair number of people from both those institutions, and almost to a person, the people I know from Princeton have much deeper affection for the school they went to. There's something particular about that experience. They like the campus environment better. People from Harvard view things very differently. So I feel very comfortable saying these are hard numbers. Numbers can only take you so far. But I believe anecdotally that it does in fact tell you something about those two schools. Does it mean Princeton is demonstrably better than Harvard? No, absolutely not. It's minutely better if you look at it on our rankings. And does it mean that Princeton is hugely better than the number 10 school in the country? I don't think so. The rankings, again, on those top levels are very tightly bunched up. But does it tell you something? Does it give you a piece of information that's useful? I would argue that yes, it does. And that's the case for all of the metrics. It's about 26 things that we have, 26 basic numbers that we used in the formula for the rankings. They are based on not our guesswork, but they're based on reporting. They're based on what journalists do. We talk to people. We've talked to people in the industry. We talk to faculty. We talk to guidance counselors, high school students, parents, and we revise things over time. This is not a static measure that's been there in stone from the beginning. We have used this as a basis to really help our own reporting about higher education in general. We have people who are out there all the time looking for ways to gather information better, refine our methodology. One factor that's in the rankings is called what we call the peer survey. And this is a survey, a statistical survey that we send out to 4,000 top college administrators, presidents, provosts, deans of admissions. So it goes to all the major schools in the country. And what we ask them on this survey is to rate their peers, to rate the competition. Who do you think is doing a good job in your field? So if you're a small liberal arts college in the Northeast, who do you think is doing, on a scale of 1 to 5, who's 5, who's 4, who's 3, et cetera? We obviously say don't rank your own school, which we vet this statistically, so we take off the tops and the bottoms and we make sure that it's a valid measure. This is well, I should say, in the old days, that's all that we did, and that's how many surveys of popularity surveys are done these days. We have now moved that to a weight of 25%, so it's a significant part of the survey, but we've put in 75% of other hard data factors as the years have gone on. This peer survey is one of the things that has become something of a sensitive point with some of our critics. And I think when I was mentioning before these group of liberal arts college presidents, I would say that's probably the thing they object to the most. And their feeling is that, again, coming back to the basic premise, schools they can't rank their competition. They feel that it's invalid for them to be making these kind of judgments about comparable institutions. One of the arguments is, which I find sort of comical, is we don't know enough about these other institutions to rank them, which I always say, gee, if you asked me to rank magazines, I could do a pretty good job of that. I wouldn't be shy about that. But I realize that the academic world in some ways is a little different, and we are asking people to engage in something that's not pure social science, and in some cases, these folks are in fact social scientists. So there is some difficulty there. But we're very clear in saying if you don't feel comfortable, you don't know enough about another school, don't rank it. We still get a very statistically high response rate. We get more than 50% of the folks who get that survey responding to us. The data survey, the data we get from the colleges, which we also check against other standards, we get probably about a 98% response rate. So there is somewhat of a disparity that I think we've probably become the single largest collector of college-level data in the country now. We've sort of achieved this stature where I guess we have a trust factor with institutions that we work very hard to get the numbers right. The peer survey is obviously less it has less high of a response rate, although for industry standards, still a quite high response rate. A response rate of 20% would be considered pretty high for a survey like this, and as I say, we're well over 50%. But we take all those numbers together in this formula, crunch them, publish them in multiple forms, and as I say, very transparently, so anybody can see what we're doing. But that's what results in the rankings that appear first in the magazine, most prominently these days on the website, because our usnews.com has become just a tremendously heavily trafficked place. This kind of data is really ideally suited to the web. And what always astonishes me is the magazine was published 2 weeks ago. We go to press on Friday night, and Thursday midnight, 12:01 a.m. Thursday is when we turn the website on, and we usually get a tremendous flood of traffic. We get literally millions of page views in the first few days of when the site is up, from all kinds of places: China, India, Taiwan, Korea. But we also are publishing on the web 50,000 pages of data about colleges. So we have, it's not, again, not just a top 10 ranking, it is an extraordinary amount of data which people can then sort and crunch to their own specifications, so they can run their own lists, run their own rankings. So it's become quite an institution, I think, and we hope that it provides a very valuable bit of hard information for people to make use of. When it comes to the question of how to use this, I always think, first of all, there's two audiences out there. One is the audience of graduates and alumni, and occasionally even a few college presidents. And these are the folks who I think are in it for the bragging rights, the folks who went to a certain school or have a friend who went to a certain school, and they're just fascinated, who's up, who's down. It gives them an opportunity to talk about the relative merits or changes of different schools. And I think that's all great. We know these are the sort of gawkers, the drive-by folks who come to our website, and they're always checking things out. My hope is that people take that in the proper perspective, and the fact that Amherst is one behind Williams this year really is not a catastrophe for either of those institutions, particularly for their graduates who are all making so much money it shouldn't really matter. The second audience are really the people who are looking at colleges, the parents and the students. And we think that the rankings serve two purposes there. The first is it is a great snapshot. It is a way to get a very quick look at this enormous array of colleges, 1,400, looked at through your own profile. How do your SAT scores stack up, or your child's SAT scores? What are realistic places to think about? How do you, if you look at our book, it's broken up by geography, different sizes of schools, regional schools, national universities, state universities. So you have multiple ways to take your profile and apply it to this big universe of schools. Perhaps you're living in the Northeast and you think you would like to look at some schools in the South. Well, suddenly here's a whole array of schools that you may not have heard of that are available. Here's Harvard, and on the same page is Rice University in Houston, or Vanderbilt, or schools in California. So it's a very good way to get that sort of quick read on things, and then to begin to refine your search. What we tell people, and we sort of put our own disclaimers in there, is this is not the be-all and end-all. It is not meant to be a finite to the decimal point resource to decide that, boy, if I'm applying to the number 12 school in America, and if I can't get into the number 12 and I have to settle for number 14, I may as well just shoot myself, or give up college altogether. Well, I mean, that's just absurd, obviously. The difference between the number 12 school and number 14 school is negligible. The difference between number 12 and number 32 is probably relatively negligible. I suppose there's a difference between number 12 and number 82, and one of those schools in between is probably right for the particular student, but we're not making that judgment. We're certainly not trying to impose any kind of a standard on that. The people who care about it the most, and do seem to become the most hot under the collar when things don't go their way, are in fact the administrators of some of these schools. If they do well, as Skip pointed out, they will tend to advertise it. If they don't do well, I guess they tend to boycott it. I don't know. I guess maybe that's human nature. But that audience, the academic audience, that the university presidents, et cetera. That's really not the audience that we care about. That is, you know, they have their own agendas. There's reasons that this is good for them or bad for them, or they'll make up their own mind. Personally, I think we do so much more good than harm to any of these institutions merely by bringing them to the attention of folks, you know, as I say, not just in this country, but, you know, in abroad, where a lot of schools are drawing very heavily on foreign student bases. And if you saw our web traffic from Korea and Taiwan and India, for instance, just in the last week, you know that there's a lot of people around the world that are paying attention to this as a first step resource to begin to try to understand the American higher education system. So I think, you know, I also raise an issue and with universities, and to my own personal sense, I'm sort of a little baffled that we've become this hot button issue for so many, not so many, but a fairly hearty collection of critics in the last couple of months or year. And this is coming at a time when higher education has got some really serious problems of its own. I mean, if you think about, I don't know if we've got any administrators in this audience, but I know we got a lot of people paying tuition in this audience, and you're aware of that aspect of it. If you think of the rise in college costs, first of all, underlying everything, cost is the driving factor. People say, why is everyone paying so much attention to U.S. News? Why? Well, number one reason, because college has become such an enormously expensive undertaking that people are just exhibiting, you know, sane, rational consumer behavior. They want more information about what they're spending their money on. I mean, the idea that college now costs, you know, in some cases more than a house, would suggest that if you were the seller of that product, you would want to have a lot more information available to people. Well, colleges do not do a very good job about putting this kind of information out there. You know, couple that with something like the student loan scandal, which I don't know if you've been following, but is a really pretty awful circumstance where you have universities collaborating with loan companies to steer students in their direction and ending up with students paying enormous, often enormous, usurious loan rates on their college tuition. And you've seen, you know, some people, I suspect, some people may end up going to jail over this. Certainly people have lost their jobs. But that's a real serious black mark, I think, on higher education, and speaks to this question of the real commercialization of education, that these schools are in many ways running themselves as you know, business marketing machines that are not adhering to what my favorite liberal arts presidents would suggest is, you know, the ideal of sitting and reading Socrates under the tree. You know, higher education, for the most part, isn't like that these days. It is a business. It is a consumer good. And our view is that, you know, we will continue to do what we do to try to illuminate it, really, because our goal here is just to, you know, it's not to pick sides, not to pick favorites, but it is to provide information. And the responsibility of journalists, the responsibility of U.S. News is first and foremost to get the numbers right. Secondly, to put them together in a form that we think is as fair and accurate as possible. We're not trying to skew behavior. We're not trying to induce people to do certain things. We're trying to just reflect reality, and that's what we try to do. We believe it's helpful, which is our main goal. We are a business. We do make a little bit of money out of it, but I can tell you right now, if you're looking to retire on making money off college rankings, don't go into that line of work, because it hasn't done much for me. But it's, you know, it is a part of what we do, and it's not. We rank hospitals, we rank healthcare plans. Next month we're going to start ranking cars. We've got a whole lot of things that we look at. Because we think it's a very effective tool. It's a very effective way of communicating information to people. And frankly, in the internet age, it is ideally suited to it. We're going to be ranking best places to retire, which is one of my favorites, because I'm looking for that right now, starting next month. And it's a fascinating use of the internet, because we basically don't have a ranking. We have some sort of interesting selections, but this is a pure come to our website and rank your own. Find your own best place to retire based on the criterion that matter to you. You know, some people like hot weather, some people like cold weather, some people like to be near a university, some people want to be as far away as they can. So put your own criterion in and rank it. So I just use that as an example to say I think this is a very powerful tool. It's a very powerful way of conveying information, particularly suited to the internet and the technology that we have going forward. And from our perspective, we think it's needed. We know it's needed because of the response we get. We have become number one and so gained so much focus and attention, in some ways, unfortunately, by default, because nobody else is doing this, or nobody else is doing it as well as we are doing it. And I say that with all humility. I would just as soon have some other people come in and take the heat away from us, but I don't see them stepping forward. So until that happens, we will keep doing what we're doing, and I hope we, as long as we get the numbers right, we will be able to stand behind it. But if anybody's got a better way to do it, I am happy to hear it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Kelly. My boss, I think, oversold how much of a critic I actually am. I went to the number 26 liberal arts college in the country. I graduated for my PhD, the number 1 public university in the country, so I don't think the rankings can be that bad. I come at this in the same way you do. I think you are performing a public service, and I love that the focus is on students and parents as consumers of a good. You're focusing on a very difficult, expensive proposition for them, and I think any information that they can get in doing it, making the right choice, is an invaluable public service. My background's in policy. I worked for the California State Legislature, and we were very interested in trying to get the right information out to parents and students. And as a policy question, these rankings ask me, what do we value? What's important? What we measure is what we think is important. So that's where my problem with the rankings come in. Kevin Carey at a think tank called the Education Sector wrote a review of college rankings, and I'm just going to read excerpts from what Kevin wrote. The U.S. News ranking system is deeply flawed. Instead of focusing on the fundamental issues of how well colleges and universities educate their students and how well they prepare them to be successful after college, the magazine's rankings are almost entirely a function of 3 factors: fame, wealth, and exclusivity. They directly or indirectly account for 95% of a school's ranking. As a result, the influential rankings have led colleges and universities to focus their energies on becoming wealthier, more famous, more exclusive, often at the expense of what matters most: educating their students well. Because today's rankings reward institutions for wealth, many college presidents are no longer intellectual leaders, but narrowly focused fundraisers. Because rankings reward institutions for their scholarly reputations, colleges recruit faculty who are distinguished in research, even if their teaching skills are subpar. Because the current rankings reward colleges for selective admissions and high freshman SAT scores, more scholarships are going to wealthy, high-achieving applicants instead of lower-income students who need financial aid the most. What the U.S. News rankings do, in effect, is confirm the status of colleges and universities that, by virtue of their prestige, are valuable to students irrespective of the quality of the education they provide. But the vast majority of college students, 90%, do not attend selective colleges and universities. U.S. News have not deliberately excluded measures that shed light on the quality of college teaching and learning. They exclude such measures because information that answers questions that would be most helpful to the students: where are the students taught the best? Where do students learn the most? Where do students have the best chance of earning a degree? Where are students prepared to succeed in their lives and careers? This information simply hasn't been available. I gave you a handout here. This is the education sector's breakdown of the college rankings. On the front, this is what the U.S. News and World Report currently does. On the back, the small one, is what they propose instead. And the 4 factors on the back one are teaching, learning, graduation, and life success. So I just really have a challenge to U.S. News and World Report. Is a public service, play a valuable role for parents and for families. 90% of the students that are reading your magazine don't go to the top colleges. I think that they could really benefit from figuring out, with your help, which schools could help them the most. Thank you very much.
Well, let me answer that quickly and then take some questions. I'm very familiar with that paper and have appeared with Kevin Carey, and it's a thoughtful paper. He's done a good look at U.S. News. I would probably quarrel with some of the particular ways he breaks it down: fame, wealth, exclusivity. There's some more complicated factors in there. But I would also argue that, first of all, wealth matters. Wealth matters in American society, no question about it. Fame matters. Reputation is something that is a proxy for other things. It's not schools do not stay famous because they produce generations of second-rate graduates. They're famous because I think in many cases it builds on itself. So reputation is a tangible measure. Exclusivity is important because inputs matter. The people you bring into a university may be the single most important factor in what comes out of the university. Students of high caliber will help shape the behavior of other students of high caliber, no question about it. So I don't think these are invalid measures. I think the bigger problem, and as Keith mentioned in Kevin's paper, there are other measures that you would like to have, that we would like to have. They don't exist, or they don't exist in a way that they are obtainable. If you look, I mean, we're going to get way deep in the weeds on this one, but if you look at the back of that paper, you see NSSE, Academic Challenge. NSSE is a survey that's done out of a group based at the University of Indiana. It's NSSE for short. It's the National Survey of Student Engagement. And it was founded about 10 years ago as an alternative, to be an alternative to the U.S. News rankings. And it's based on doing actual surveys of students on campus. So they ask questions like, how many papers did you write this month? And how many pages of papers did you write? And how much time did you spend with your professor? And was your course taught by a teaching assistant or a full professor? And things that get at least at that level of what's actually going on campus. They have been trying now for, as I say, 10 years. I believe there are about 500 schools in the country participate with the survey in some form. So already we're ranking 1,400 schools, so you're at a little more than a third of schools are willing to participate in the survey. Of the schools that participate in the survey, almost none of them, about 150, are willing to make their data public. We actually publish that data. If you go on usnews.com, you can see the 150 schools that participate in NSSE and what their scores are. However, those scores are relatively meaningless because they're not comparable. So let's say you wanted to go to a big, public university in the Midwest, and your choices were University of Arkansas and University of Oklahoma and Texas and what all else. You can't compare them because maybe, I don't know for a fact, but maybe one of those schools actually publishes their data. The other schools don't publish it, so it's meaningless. This gets back to this bigger problem that I mentioned before, is that universities are doing a crummy job being transparent. They are not willing, they have all this great information, they don't want to publish it. So where does that leave me as a journalist? I do the best I can getting the information I can. Pretty much going down that list. I'm not aware of any of these things that are actually gainable. The CLA is a college learning assessment. It's a test, very interesting test that kids take as they're graduating from college. I would dearly love to have CLA scores for every college in America. That would tell you something. How are kids coming out of a school? But that's not public, and many schools don't use it. Similarly, freshman retention and graduation rates we do use, and that's a very important measure we make a lot of. Kevin would make more of it. Maybe he's right. We're certainly open to looking at things like that, employment results and things like that. Schools have this data, but for the most part, they don't publish it. So that's really where we end up on this. Unfortunately, we have been a proponent of more data, not less, and there's at least some sort of nascent movement out there, not only on the part of some of the think tank folks, academics, but you saw Margaret Spellings, the Secretary of Education, had a report on higher ed last fall in which she said, colleges and universities have got to start producing some more accountability measures. People need to know what they're getting for their money. And there's been a fierce resistance on the part of schools to do anything along those lines. So it's an interesting battle. I suspect one that's going to go on. We're certainly going to do our part to keep pushing for more information, not less. But at the moment, as I say, I think we are the state of the art, and I will fully agree with Keith. It's not perfect, but it is it is the best that's out there. So, other thoughts from any of you? There's a question way in the back there.
I mean, I teach at law school, so I know how you do that more than anything else. And what you do is you go from 1 to 100, and then you stop ranking. You just have the third and the fourth. But of course, the place that you break, roughly the middle, is the place where the largest number of schools clump, and where the difference between 95 and 105 is the least meaningless. So it seems to me that another thing that you could do, that I know you can do because you did it about 5 years ago before you stopped letting us click on the overall ranking and find out where we were, is let us rank the entire thing. I think you do that with medical schools. I don't know what you do with colleges. But it seems to me that that there are ways that are fairly easy that would allow you to give people more information than you do. As to the outcome measures, one, I think you're right, they're not there. Two, well, you know, you're a journalist. I mean, you could, I think part of the thing that you have as operator of a large journalism outfit is the ability to go out there and maybe do some of these outcome surveys. Thanks.
Yeah, well, it's the issue of whether you rank by number or by bands or tiers has been debated very hotly out there, and you really get folks literally in the field coming down on both sides of it. You know, would you rather be numbered 99, or, you know, number 101, or would you rather be in the third tier? Certainly, there's, you know, I guess any of the schools in the top from 101 to 125 would rather be ranked by number, and the schools that go behind that would probably rather be in the third tier. So you get, there's no good answer to that, but we will look at that. I think, again, the point being, I always think it's better to give people more information than less. So it may make more sense to just give people the actual number, you know, give them the best disclaimer and say, here's how we think you can use it. But at the end of the day, people are smart. You know, consumers, I believe consumers are smart, and they want good information, and then they will do with it what they choose. Yeah, we've got a question back there in the corner.
Just a quick question. Could you tell us the scientific basis of why these different issues are weighted the way they are? What was the process that you all came to that, for instance, decided to only write graduate alumni contributions, which seems like the only thing on the scale that tests sort of satisfaction at only 5% versus the other
Yeah.
weights?
Well, there is no scientific basis for the weights. There's no way to come up with a scientific basis for the weights. I mean, the numbers themselves are checked for statistical significance. I mean, there's, you know, we have moving averages, we have a regression analysis that we do on the grad school survey. We use you know, standard statistical practices to get the individual numbers as correct and as fair as we can make them. The way we group them together is, in effect, our, you know, formula for Coke. I mean, we have evolved it, as I was saying before, as journalists over time. And, you know, it has become this kind of interesting institution that's built up. If something's a 30% weight and you want to reduce it, well, what are you going to replace it with? You still have to add up to 100. So we've modified it over time. There's a new factor that we've incorporated this year that I won't bore you with, but it has to do with Pell Grants and low-income students. And the intent was not to create an incentive to pursue certain behavior, but to take away the disincentive, if that makes sense. We're constantly trying to figure out how to make the playing field as level as possible, to eliminate the gamesmanship and to keep people from trying to manipulate the results. We're trying to reflect reality. That's our intention. But how that formula comes together, it's our best judgment. I mean, we sit around a couple times a year and look at those weights and say, you know, things change over time. You know, is the SAT as important as it used to be? Should we maybe make graduation rate higher? We don't do that in a vacuum. It's based on talking to people. You know, class rank has diminished in stature as a lot of schools don't use it as much as a factor. So we're looking at diminishing that. You know, this peer survey that I talked about, it may well be that we can come up with a better way to do that. So that's the process. We don't make any claim that this is, you know, a scientifically sound and you know, consistent year after year. We say it's a snapshot of the reality this year. This is based on our best judgment. When we put these factors in this basket, this is how we think they should butt up against each other. So that's how we do it. Yeah.
With the, excuse me, with the swimsuit issue.
Yeah.
What is the college ranking?
We did, well, the magazine itself, it's one of the interesting myths that it's so great for the magazine. We sell, most of the subscriptions we sell are to subscribers. People get it in the mail. We sell about 2 million subscriptions that way. The number of newsstand sales, like from an airport or a bookstore or something, is really very minuscule for us. We may sell 30, 40,000 copies a week that way. The college issue is one of our top 10 sellers, but it's not demonstrably. There's other issues that you routinely sell better. Our hospitals issues, for instance, usually sells better. We may sell 10% more, something like that. Now the internet is really the place where I think we get both the internet, and we sell a newsstand guide, which again is very much directed at parents and students. And that, we're selling a few 100,000 copies of that, and the internet, as I say, we get millions of hits. Good. I think it's on my list. I think they told me they wanted me to look at some places when I was down here. They're working on some stuff. There's a bunch of places I know in Arkansas.
Dr.
Yeah.
Kimbrell?
I actually had two questions, but Keith sort of covered the first one. And in full disclosure, my name is Walter Kimbrell. I'm the president of Philander Smith College here in Little Rock. I'm one of Lloyd Thacker's disciples, and we have boycotted the rankings, and you rewarded me with the unranked category this year, so I'd like to thank you for that. But so I'll ask my second question. My first question was regarding those 15 points, and 13 of the 15 are clearly impacted by the wealth of either the student or the institution. But this was my other question. If you look at the top half of the top tier national schools, so what I did was a few years ago, I used to have tiers 1, 2, 3, and 4, and then you combine them. So if I take really that true top tier, they have roughly 1/3 the total of low-income students, 1/5 the total of black students, and 1/10 the total of non-traditional students as bottom-tier schools. Since black, poor, and non-traditional students generally have lower SAT scores, are retained and graduate at lower levels than white, rich, and traditional students, aren't you really rewarding those, with few exceptions, that enroll a minimum number of those students from those groups, while penalizing those of us who enroll lots of those students?
Mm-hmm. Well, it's certainly a very good question. I mean, when I was mentioning before about working Pell Grant data into our graduation rate, it's specifically to address that question. It is not going to resolve that question at all. And we did it on a fairly small percentage basis this year just to see what the outcome was. And it actually did improve a number of schools in the rankings. UCLA, for instance, I have not studied this, and I'm sure we'll hear a lot of study, but just specifically UCLA and Berkeley rose relative to some of the other big state institutions because they have a higher percentage of low-income students. So if they were in effect getting a penalty, we seem to have at least somewhat corrected for that. We're mindful of that. There's a couple issues there. One is, again, we are not trying to drive behavior. We are not trying to influence behavior. We are trying to, in effect, reflect what are the industry standards. So that said, we're looking for ways to take the disincentives away, not to create incentives. The second factor is these are societal issues that we play, I believe, a very small role in. I mean, U.S. News gets blamed for a lot of things that are not our responsibility, or that are not, in fact, demonstrably are not our fault. And I can give you examples. There was a statistic which was widely cited a number of years ago called the yield factor. Yield is of the number of students that a school accepts, what percentage go to the school. So the higher the yield, the more, in effect, popular the school. And there are wide disparities. Harvard's yield is about 80%. 80% of the kids who get admitted to Harvard will go to Harvard. Princeton, now this is a reversal of the alumni thing, Princeton's yield is about 70%. It's significantly lower than Harvard's. It's quite high. 70% is an enormous yield. But it's an interesting, important measure. We had it as a small factor in our rankings, and people said this was being abused by the schools because it was forcing them to emphasize early admissions. Huge numbers of kids were being pressured to go apply to school early, take early admissions, and sign on for the school. We did our research. We said we don't think it's really doing that, but we decided to take it out. It wasn't that important. We took it out, even though I think it's fascinating. We took it out. That was 5 years ago. We've looked subsequently in 5 years. The change in early admissions practices is almost zero. The only school that dropped its early admissions practices was Harvard, because guess what? It didn't really matter to Harvard. They could do what they wanted. I think University of Virginia dropped it too. So it had no effect. Colleges will do what they do for the most part for their own reasons. They will seek students of a certain caliber, whether it's merit-based or need-based, based on what they think their mission is. They will manage their enrollment based on what's good for them, based on filling seats in a classroom. I mean, I firmly believe that that's the case. U.S. News is a minor player in that. Again, we are trying to reflect reality, not create it. We're trying to give people, parents and students, a window into that reality. But the reality is going to go on. You know, I went to college long before there was a U.S. News ranking, and all of this stuff was going on. All these schools were doing the same gamesmanship, and I don't think it's going to go away with or without us. But to your question, you know, what we don't want to do is in any inadvertent way create incentives for, you know, for bad behavior here, and that's what we're trying to. We try very hard to make sure that that's not happening.
We have time for one more question, Martin.
I am a recent college graduate, and I know that U.S. News gets a lot of coverage for its college rankings, but not as much is covered about, you know, its graduate professional schools. And so do you find the same level of discourse in the rankings of the graduate and professional schools, especially since some publications like Business Week have their own ranking systems, and how does that, you know, stack up to, you know, the Business Week or the ABA Journal?
Yeah, good question. Interesting. Business schools in particular, what I was saying before, I wish there was more competition. In business schools, there's a lot of competition. Business Week, the Wall Street Journal, even the Times of London they rank American business schools because they're so popular. We're one of a variety of rankers there. It's a very interesting kind of thriving market. You can look at the methodology and make your own choices. We think ours is the best, but other people can make other judgments, but we don't get any criticism. The B schools are just happy to be in the mix. Law schools, we're fairly singular. There's nobody doing law schools in a significant way. We do get occasional criticism that, you know, we're sort of skewing behavior. I think it's less pronounced than it has been. We sort of, and there was a data question there too. I think we've kind of reached a truce with the law schools for now, where everybody is kind of respecting what we do. It's very valuable. Medical schools, and interestingly, as an adjunct to medical schools, hospitals in particular, people in the medical profession love to be ranked. They're like, make it tougher. I mean, doctors are just a completely different breed. I was in a group of doctors saying, you know, your heart mortality rate isn't tough enough. You've got to tighten the screws on that. It's, you know, people are getting away with, you know, bad behavior out there. So they're coming from a completely different perspective. They're extremely competitive and want the measures put on them. So we have a very different relationship there. So,
Brian, thank you very much. Keith, good points, good points. Thank you all for coming. Now, one of the great things we have at the Clinton School with our speaker series is that, you know, today we talked about the rankings of colleges and universities, but this guy is the editor of U.S. News and World Report, above and beyond just this particular rankings issue. And so now we're going to adjourn, if you'll pardon us, with Brian and our students, who are going to have a session with him about current events, which will be fascinating with the Clinton School students. And secondly, I want to introduce the new director of the Arkansas Association of Four-Year Colleges, who is here, and that is former Senator Tim Wooldridge. Tim, we're glad to have you. And finally, believe it or not, we're not going to have any more programs for the rest of the week. It's really tough not to go 2 days in a row without having a program. But if you will look at the post-Labor Day scheduled on your flyer, take a couple of days off and get with us because we're going to have 5 in a row. Thank you all very much for coming.